All right, welcome back, guys. This is our third and final part of today's lecture on education inequality. In the previous part, we talked a little bit about how parenting practices condition education inequality by social class. And in this part, we're going to talk a little bit more about the structural causes that create inequality, specifically within schools. Right. So there are lots of reasons why there are education inequalities within one school, including the practice of tracking, which we're going to talk a little bit about now. So generally, if you've been to a public school, you have experienced tracking in some way. This is generally the practice of separating students into different classes by academic ability, and this could be into different kinds of subjects or the curriculum for the subjects that you're taught. So, for example, if your school had AP classes, any kind of remedial classes or college prep classes, that's a form of tracking, right? That based on school performance, you were placed into either kind of like the average baseline class, an advanced class, or perhaps even some sort of like remedial class. Okay, and this generally emerges by looking at students' performance and often by teacher recommendations as well. And theoretically, tracking is good, right, because it gives students either the correct assistance or the challenges they need. So really, it's designed in theory to promote students' learning, right, to create more individualized learning for different groups of students. Okay. However, it has kind of a lot of unintended consequences that exacerbate some of this inequality that we've been talking about, right? So if we look at the patterns of who's tracked where, low socioeconomic status and minority students are more likely to be low track, right? This could be due potentially to a couple things, right? It could be because these students are entering the classroom underprepared in the first place, right? For reasons we have previously talked about, right? So they're more likely to be low track. Or as kind of I note in this third bullet point here, tracking recommendations are influenced by social bias, right? That teachers are more likely to bump up their white students because of sort of these unconscious biases and prejudices, and low SES and minority students are more likely to be lower tracked because they're not perceived to be as academically successful. But there's also some issues even besides like who gets tracked where. There's also issues in terms of like once you're in the track, what your education looks like. Generally, schools' best resources and their most experienced teachers are given to high track classrooms. So what this means is that even if students are separated by ability, and that's good, that the students in the low track are not being given the same quality of resources as students in high tracks, right? So theoretically, if those were distributed equally, everyone would be getting a good education at the level they need, but that's not happening, right? The high track students are actually being rewarded with better educational quality than lower track students, right? Moreover, tracking trajectory is determined in our early education, right? So for example, take one student who in middle school, for example, is tracked into a higher level of math, which was the case in my middle school. Okay, so you have one student who's tracked high in math, one student who kind of just not even tracked low, right? Tracked kind of at the foundational baseline course. That kind of remains with those students as they go on into high school, even if that lower track student excels, right? That they like learn a lot and clearly should be in a higher tracked math course, right? Because like it's harder to catch up to those higher track students already, you're kind of like it determines the entire trajectory of your educational career, right? And there's kind of no way to catch up after a certain point. So what are the consequences here? Like the structure of our public education system is exacerbating these inequalities through tracking, right? By benefiting largely high SES white students. And then also the quality of education within one given school is going to vary really widely depending on what kinds of classes you're in and what track you're following. But now let's talk a little bit more about differences within schools, right? Tracking shows us differences within one given school, but there are also wide differences between two different schools, okay? So there's sort of this ongoing American ideology that we hold personal responsibility over our fate, right? That we are masters of our fate, right? But as individuals, we're really not able to take any responsibility over our surroundings or the society that we live in, right? We're collectively responsible for that. And that ties into the idea of like neighborhood, right? That as individuals, we really, especially growing up, have no control over what our neighborhood looks like or what's going on in our neighborhood, right? We're only accountable for our personal household and our personal being. So the neighborhood you grow up in largely determines your educational trajectory, and we have lots of data that supports this, and it happens through a variety of ways, right? So one is student poverty. Okay, so if you are a student growing up in a low SES household in a low SES neighborhood, this creates issues for your educational attainment, right? Your ability, for example, to buy textbooks or to participate in after-school activities, right? To have a stable house to learn in, et cetera, et cetera. Do you live in a neighborhood that has high rates of crime, right? We know that this deeply impacts children because they don't have a stable environment in which to learn and to grow and to develop these cognitive skills. Most importantly, I want to talk now about how schools obtain their financial resources, okay? And this is deeply rooted in the neighborhood that they're in, and it also correlates with social class and race. Okay, so for those of you who don't know, and we talked, especially on the discussion forum, I think we talked a little bit about it when we spoke about race and social class. Schools are largely funded through taxes, right? So they get some federal funding, they get some state funding, but predominantly they're funded through local taxes. And this is specifically, of course, public schools. We're not talking about private schools right now. This means that if you live in a neighborhood where the property taxes and the income taxes are higher, that your school is going to get more financial resources versus a neighborhood where the property taxes are lower, and so there's less financial contribution towards the schools. Okay, so this setup means that depending on the average SES of a given neighborhood, the two public schools are going to look wildly different, and they're going to have very different financial resources than if they were on equal playing fields in terms of the social class of that neighborhood overall. So what are the consequences of this then? Why does it matter that schools have different resources, right? Well, consider that schools with more financial resources are more likely to get experienced teachers who want a better salary than teachers straight out of school, or in some states, teachers who only have a bachelor's degree and don't have a master's in education. Okay. They'll have more money to buy new up-to-date textbooks, to have classroom supplies, to be able to have a variety of different kinds of after-school clubs and be able to compensate their teachers for running those clubs. Okay, so the amount of money a school has really has huge consequences, not only for the experience of students in that school, but also their outcomes, right? Do they have up-to-date textbooks that will give them up-to-date material to help them on statewide or national exams, for example? Do schools have the money to have small classrooms, right? Or are you in a classroom with 30 other students? And we know that being in a small classroom helps nurture a student's educational growth, right? And that they can get individualized attention. So really, we see a huge correlation in education inequality with the amount of school resources we have. And we can think back to those graphs we looked at earlier that showed us how strongly correlated SES is with educational outcome, even at a kindergarten level. Okay, so to think about this a little bit more, let's take a look at how students of color are distributed among schools, because this is part of the picture, right? We can't just talk about social class and SES when we're talking about school resources. We also know that race is integrated into this as well. Right, so this is from that same New York Times article. it tells us that enrollment of Black students in majority white Southern schools peaked at 43.5% in 1988. Right. So what we see from this is that that integration of Black and white students in the United States hasn't changed so much since 1988. Enrollment of Black students in majority white Southern schools declined actually in 2011 by 23.2%. So not only are we fully integrated and have balanced public schools in terms of race, we're actually seeing a decline and we're seeing increased segregation in our public school districts. Almost 90% of Black students in Washington, D.C. attend segregated schools, which are defining as less than 10% white. 81.7% of Black students in New York City attend segregated schools. And in 2011 to 2012, 3 states had more than 50% of their Latino students in segregated schools. Right, so what this is telling us is that while we no longer have formal segregation in our school systems, right, that's not legal, what we see is what we call de facto segregation, right? What this means is that our schools are segregating by race because of some other reason, not because we're legally mandating it, but as we're going to talk about, because of the race, the link of race to socioeconomic status, right? And again, we had a whole conversation about this on the discussion forum. If you missed that, go take a look at that because I think that'll be helpful as well. So we know that neighborhood is linked to socioeconomic status, right? That some neighborhoods are obviously really expensive, the houses are priced really high, the school districts are good, right? The property taxes are high, and some neighborhoods are cheaper to live in, okay? So because we know from our previous class that race and social class are highly linked, this means that white families who have accumulated more wealth over time, who are more likely to make a higher collective family income, have the ability to choose to live in those wealthier neighborhoods, right? Of course, this doesn't mean that all white families have that option. There is certainly low SES families as well, but on average, as a population trend, white families have the option for more mobility, right? Meaning that they have a choice of where they want to live because they have the financial resources to do that. So, for example, these families then have an opportunity to shop around not only for a house they really love, but a house that's in a good school district, right? That it's family friendly, that they can raise their kids in. So, in essence, why we see this informal racial segregation happening is because white families have the wealth to move to areas with really nice schools, right? Where the property taxes are higher, the schools have more resources, okay? And that on average, families of color do not have this option because they don't have the accumulated wealth that white families do. So they don't have the number of choices about where to move. And so we're seeing this kind of de facto segregation, right? Where all the white families are congregated in school systems with really good schools, where their kids are going to get a good education, and students of color are kind of left in these neighborhoods where the property taxes are not as high and the schools are not getting as many resources. Okay, and this has huge consequences, right, for the experience of students of color in these districts, right? So nationwide, districts with the most students of color receive 15% less per student in state and local funding, right? So we know that these students of color are going to schools with less funding from the state and local levels. Schools with high levels of Black or Latino enrollment have nearly 2 times as many first-year teachers as schools with low Black or Latino enrollment, right? So this means that students of color are more likely to go to schools who are hiring less experienced teachers. And that doesn't mean they're bad teachers, but it means that they're less experienced. They don't know what they're doing as much, not because they're bad teachers again, but because they haven't had the same opportunities. And they're hiring these teachers because they're cheaper, right? They don't have the same experiences. Minority students are more likely to be taught by an inexperienced teacher than experienced teachers in 33 states. Just 1/3 of public high schools with high Black and Latino enrollment offer calculus, right? So not only is the experience and the quality of teaching different, but also the classes that they can take is different because of the funding. Fewer than 3 in 10 students in gifted and talented programs are Black or Latino. Right? So again, this has nothing to do with how hard an individual is working or how much they want to go to college or achieve a certain level of educational attainment. This has to do with the opportunities that are available to these people, right? That because of this wealth gap between white families and families of color, we're seeing that they have families of color have fewer options about where to send their kids to school, and that they are more likely to have to send their kids to school in a place that is underfunded or where the teachers are less experienced. Okay. So then let's refer back to this graph we looked at in the first part of today's lectures. First part of today's lecture. So it should be clear at this point, right, why high-income students are more likely to complete their college degree, right? Again, it's not just about wanting it enough or working hard enough. These students who complete their degree are more likely to grow up in a good school district that gave them good college counseling, right, that had those opportunities, where they probably took a lot of practice SAT tests, and they were then able to go to good colleges that gave them the support they needed to succeed, right? Moreover, high-income students, as we're going to talk about in a second, are less likely to need a part-time job. They can just kind of focus on their studies and focus on the degree, right? So kind of playing off of that, right? Colleges, so we thought about high school, now we're jumping to college, right? Colleges are set up to support high-income students, right, and their lifestyle. The quote-unquote ideal college student is someone who doesn't need a part-time job, right, who can just attend classes, who can participate in kind of the traditional collegiate experience, right, can join clubs, sports, et cetera, et cetera. And much of what college has to offer costs money, right? So if you think about joining Greek life, for example, there's a huge financial cost to being in a fraternity or sorority, and many students don't have those resources, right? So the students who are best supported by their colleges and who the college is really set up to have, right, are those who have the money to not have a job, right, to just go to class, who have the money to seek out tutoring and other opportunities on campus. They're not the students who need a part-time job, who don't have the money to participate in quintessential collegiate experiences, and not the students who, for example, are going to be financially punished by switching majors, right, who to take like extra classes to make up lost classes if they switch a major or something like that. Moreover, the current reforms we have in place to reduce this inequality aren't working, and they often get it wrong about why we see inequality in the first place. So kind of the first mistake we make, just on a very basic level, is that as a country, we have an expectation that there will be similar results for kids in different school districts. And of course, this is unreasonable given that we live in a highly unequal society. How is it that a low SES student is going to perform in the same way as a high SES student, given that their school district looks really different, given that their home life might look really different? And without addressing those structural differences, it's really unfair to expect that people will perform the same. Okay. Another way we often get it wrong as a society is we expect individual accountability, right? We say to people, well, it's up to you to get past those constraints, to overcome those barriers, to pick yourself up by your bootstraps. And again, we're talking about these deeply rooted structural issues, and the individual can't change structure, right? We need structural reform. So for example, the No Child Left Behind policy we previously talked about is an example of getting this wrong, that by expecting individual schools to, to perform on testing the same as well-funded schools is unreasonable, right? They don't have the same textbooks. They don't have the same infrastructure to help their students perform, right? And so what happens is that those schools are punished because they can't overcome these structural issues, right? They just don't have the same resources or the same capabilities as other schools. The other issue, right, is, and this connects to No Child Left Behind, is that we often hold schools accountable through high stakes testing, meaning that in order to get funding, we expect schools to perform a certain way, their students to perform to a certain standard, and what happens is that ultimately people are punished. Charter schools is another way that we often get it wrong, right? More and more we're seeing charter schools pop up as alternatives for people who don't want to send their kids to the standard public schools, right? And theoretically, these charter schools offer different opportunities than low SES schools with few resources, right? And what happens is, there's a lot to talk about with charter schools, but they're often unregulated and they're not great, right? And I'll just kind of leave it at that. If you want to do more research on charter schools, I highly recommend it, or reach out to me. I can provide you more resources, but I'm going to kind of leave that there for now. We often also misunderstand sort of school segregation, right? That de facto segregation we were talking about, where schools not only are differentiated by social class because of the neighborhood, but also consequently by race, right? That because of this correlation between social class and race, we actually see some sort of school segregation. Right now, the response to that has been offering school vouchers, which is essentially a program that offers high achieving students in poorer neighborhoods the opportunity to go to a better funded public school, right? And in theory, that's great. Like, we should give students who are performing and need to be challenged a leg up and offer them opportunities in other places where they're going to get help and resources they couldn't get in their own neighborhood. That sounds great in practice, but what that really does is it lifts individual people up, right? It doesn't change the structure of education as a whole, right? And it leaves behind many other kids in those neighborhoods who could be high achieving if they had the correct resources and the correct help. So rather than offering vouchers, we need to think about what integration actually looks like in this country, and not just by legally banning it, because obviously it's happening anyway, but rethinking how, for example, neighborhood districts are drawn up or how schools are funded, right? If schools weren't funded by property taxes, this might be a different conversation. And then we could also think about the collegiate level, right? We have policies like affirmative action, which sort of hold admissions committees accountable to admitting a diverse student body, right? But then we need to think about what comes after college acceptance, right? How are we supporting students in college that need part-time jobs, who don't have the financial resources to maybe partake in a traditional collegiate experience? And this is tricky because we're not just talking about public schools here, we're also talking about smaller private schools as well. But that is one way of getting to the root of why certain people are more likely to complete college than others. I want to continue this conversation of reform into our discussion forum. Okay, so I want you all to consider one cause of inequality that we talked about in this lecture. So that could be parenting practices, school tracking, school funding or resources, informal segregation or de facto segregation, school vouchers, et cetera, et cetera. And I want you just to think about, like, theoretically, what is one way we could address this gap through some structural or maybe even cultural change? And here I really want to challenge you guys to think beyond individual change. So not, for example, saying like, well, if we taught parents a concerted cultivation method, if we emphasize to parents that they should be parenting this way versus this way, that's individual level, right? We don't create societal change person by person. We need to create some sort of broader structural or cultural reform, right? So I'm really going to challenge you guys. I know this is hard, but put your thinking caps on. Challenge you to come up with one structural or cultural reform that you think would target education inequality in some way. Okay, so we'll leave it there today. Again, please reach out to me for review if you'd like it before the quiz. And if not, I will see you guys in our next lecture.